Well, Jeff Wallen gave me a word of encouragement before we started. He said, when he realized I preach from a stool, he said, you realize, of course, that that's cool now, that that's in to preach from a stool. I said, I thought it was just an old guy thing. Then he added, unfortunately, he said, now, if you're really cool, you'll untuck your shirt. I said, no, that's a bridge too far, I can't do that. So I guess I didn't fully realize I was here for Pepperdine Day at North County Church with Jeff, who's at Pepperdine, and of course One by One, who's great. And I also spent a little time there. It reminded me, one of the quick Pepperdine stories I always liked is back in the old days of Saturday Night Live, they were doing a job interview skit. And apparently the job applicant had gone to UCLA, and the interviewer said, now looking at your resume, looks like you went to UCLA. We don't know UCLA. We know Pepperdine. Yeah, we're glad they know Pepperdine. So, now you know Pepperdine as well. So we've been doing, I would say, some pretty heavy lifting in the book of Job. It's widely considered the most difficult book in the Bible. And so today I thought we would try to lighten it up a little bit by talking about Job the novel. Over the years, I've changed my reading habits quite a bit. I used to read almost only nonfiction, and now I read lots and lots of novels. And even though I realize they are fiction, it seems to me that novels often contain a lot of truth, and they have pretty interesting plots, and they have some fascinating characters. In fact, I have one character whose novels I've read now 3 times, and I'm right now working through another one for the second or third time, so I've really come to love reading novels. Authors will tell you that the key to their novels is not really the plot, but it's the characters. The great novelist William Faulkner said, it begins with a character. All I can do is trot along behind him, trying to put down what he says and does. And they will tell you that the interesting characters are the ones who change during the course of the book. They call it character arc or character development. So what was the character like at the start of the novel, and then what is he or she like by the end of the novel? Scrooge is a great example from The Christmas Carol. He starts out, of course, cold-hearted, and after a series of dreams, he becomes very generous and kind, and his change of character is really the heart of the story. Children in novels often start out young and naive, but then they're put in some pretty difficult adult circumstances, and we watch them grow. Another novelist, Flannery O'Connor, said, if there is no possibility for a change in a character, we have no interest in him. So if we think about Job as a novel, there are, of course, lots of characters, and we talked about the friends a little bit last week. But the big two, the ones that we really care about in the novel, are, of course, God and Job. So today we want to look at the question, who? And if you've been here this month, you'll remember that we've asked a different question from the book of Job each week. We started with the question, why? Why suffering? And then we moved to the question, how? How do we deal with suffering? Last week the question was, what? What is our relationship with God as revealed in the book of Job? And because we're looking at characters today, we come to the question, who? Who is God in the book of Job? And then who are we to be watching Job's character development during the course of the book as our own kind of set of instructions? And then, surprise, surprise, there's even a happy ending to this kind of torturous, haunting, difficult book, so we'll even have a moment for that at the end. So starting with God, God doesn't so much change in the book of Job as he is revealed. After all of these chapters, especially the friends, as Job called them, my miserable friends, who were helping him process what had happened, finally at the end of the book, chapters 38 through 41, God finally speaks. And it turns out that he really is not a God of explanations. He responds, but he doesn't really ask the question, especially the question everyone is asking, which is why? Why has Job suffered in this way? He answers Job but he doesn't explain. Instead, interestingly, his voice comes out of a storm, out of a whirlwind, and God is posing his own questions for Job. By one count, God asks Job in these chapters 40 different questions. There are actually 66 question marks, so if you count them that way, there are even more than 40 from God. And of course, he starts with this one. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Job 38 and verse 4. And I just jotted down maybe a half a dozen of these typical, impossible questions that God asked Job. Who laid the earth's cornerstone or shut the sea behind doors? Did you ever command the morning? I certainly don't command the mornings. Do you understand the expanse of the earth? Of course, even scientists didn't understand the expanse of the earth. Do you know the rules of the heavens? Of course he doesn't. Can you send forth lightning bolts? Well, I guess probably not. And on he goes with questions about nature and about even seemingly supernatural beasts that we don't even know about today. And so why is Job being asked all these questions by God? Questions that, of course, God would be the only one who would actually know the answers. And I think what he's doing is showing Job what he, God, is doing in the world. He is sovereign over everything. And I think, in a sense, what he's saying is, Job, until you know how to run the universe as I do, don't tell me how to run your life. Don't be asking me a lot of questions about how we run your life. And by the way, Job, your life isn't the only thing I have to worry about up here. I have a big span of responsibility, of which you're an important part, but you're only one part. So Job, let's look at the full expanse of what I'm doing in the world before you start asking me a bunch of questions about your individual life. And as Job would say at the end of all of these questions, surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. You think? Yes, that's exactly what happened. So the message that we looked at earlier in the series from Isaiah chapter 55 comes again very powerfully and very clearly. God's ways are higher than our ways. God's thoughts are higher than our thoughts. And Job has this moment of realization that Job just is not going to be able to comprehend, and he probably shouldn't have been saying some of the things he was saying. As Job figured out what he had to do with God, we also have to figure out that we must let God be God. I am the sovereign Lord, and you will just have to accept that. That's just one of the realities of your life. And you know, we titled this whole series of lessons, Resetting Our Relationship with God. And I think that's an important reset for each one of us that Job had to learn, and he in turn teaches us that we have to let God be God. God is who he is, and we have to let him be that in our lives. That's an important reset, I think, for all of us. Now, moving to Job, which I think may be even more practical for us, what do we learn from Job about who we are to be? What does Job teach us about that, about who we are to be? In the end, I think one thing we learn is that God does not exist for us, but we exist for God. God doesn't exist to work into our plans. We exist for God to fit into his plans. And one thing I think we have to learn, we do learn from Job, is that we have to accept that we don't know everything. And in fact, we can't know everything. Job was starting to figure that out even earlier in the book, before God spoke. He said in Job 26 and 14, how faint the whisper we hear of him. Who then can understand the thunder of his power? Things didn't always add up. They didn't always make sense for Job. And they won't always add up for us. And Job finally figured out here at the end of the book, he shouldn't try to speak of things he could not understand. In Job 40, verses 2 and 3, he says, I am unworthy, God. How can I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth. I will say no more. Isn't that a wonderful picture? Job's just putting his hand over his mouth in the presence of God and saying, I shouldn't be speaking any further. So he understood that what he had to do was to put his faith in God, even when he did not understand what God is doing. What a great lesson, what a great reset for us. When we cannot always understand what God is doing, but our response is we put our faith in him anyway, just like Job. And he also figured out that in his worst possible suffering, I think I got ahead of myself, in his worst possible suffering, his response, as you remember earlier, is to lay his pain before God and to remain faithful. That's essentially what Job does in the story. He lays his pain and his sorrow before God, and in spite of all of these most difficult circumstances, he remains faithful. That wonderful verse in Job 13, verse 15, might be the most important thing Job uttered in the book. Though he slay me, yet I will trust in him. If you want to just take one verse from this series on Job, that's the one I would take. Though he slay me, yet I will trust in him. And further, as we said, I think the week before last, he learned that he could become somebody different and deeper in his suffering. And I've put a couple of verses here, not from Job, reaching out a bit to other passages. Psalm 119 and verse 71. It was good for me to be afflicted. It was good for me to be afflicted so that I might learn your decrees. I could grow deeper in my understanding and appreciation of you because I have been afflicted. And then that improbable verse in James chapter 1, count it pure joy when you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance, so that you may become mature and complete. And so this is Job growing deeper roots. Remember we talked about that plants that are under stress respond by growing deeper roots. And what a great picture of Job, who in stress has grown deeper roots and has come to a deeper understanding and appreciation of God. There is this great verse in the final chapter, chapter 42 and verse 5, where Job said, my ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Isn't that a great summary of what Job has learned and become in this book? My ears had heard of you, but now at a deeper and more profound level, my eyes have seen you. I get it, God. I get it, including what I don't get and can't get. So great change had come even to faithful Job. We know he has been faithful throughout, but even so, great change had come to Job. His mind had grasped God in a new way. And when his mind was able to appreciate and grasp it, it would work its way through his heart and into his very soul. Believing when he did not understand, faithful even when he suffered, growing deeper even in pain. That's Job in our book. And those are all important ways for us to reset our own relationship with God. Believing when we don't understand, faithful even in suffering, and growing deeper even in pain. So, I promised you that we have a happy ending. Who would have guessed that in this very difficult book we would end up with a happy ending? But that's what most readers want in a novel. So if we're looking at Job the novel, we got a happy ending. In the New International Version, it's labeled the epilogue. And who doesn't like a happy epilogue to a book? So why was it happy? What happened here to make it a happy ending? Well, first of all, God affirms Job's faith. He says in the final chapter, chapter 42 and verse 8, that Job has spoken the truth about him. In fact, he calls him my servant Job. And isn't that what we would all hope to hear one day? Well done, thou good and faithful servant. So he calls Job his faithful servant. And he said, you have spoken the truth about me. What a wonderful affirmation of Job's faith and understanding. But there's a little kicker. Maybe you don't just want to see the good guys have success in a happy ending, maybe you'd like to see the bad guys kicked around a little bit. Yeah, I hear a response to that. So there's a little kicker here. God tells the friends, well, yeah, Job did speak correctly of me, but you did not. And I want you to take 7 bulls and 7 rams and go to Job and offer a sacrifice and ask Job to pray for you. My friends, that's a big sacrifice. 7 bulls and 7 rams, that's a lot of sacrifice for apparently a pretty big sin on behalf of the friends. The friends just thought they were trying to comfort, but God said, no, you are not speaking the truth about me. Take 7 bulls, take 7 rams, go to your friend Job, offer a sacrifice, and ask Job to pray for you. And then Job, who had been really abandoned by his family, all his brothers and sisters, and quote, everyone who had known him before, they all came and ate with him in his house. That's part of the happy ending. They each gave Job a piece of silver and a gold ring. His fellowship and his family were restored. Job was no longer isolated and alone, as he had felt, I'm sure, throughout that book. So more good news, more happy ending. Family and friends came back together, gave him gifts, and ate at his table. And then, pretty amazing, God gave Job twice as much as he had before. 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 oxen, 1,000 donkeys, 7 sons, 3 daughters. Okay, we're still a little troubled by that, right? You can't just replace the old sons and daughters. You can't rams and sheep. But we'll just have to accept that as part of the story, 7 sons and 3 daughters. And finally, it says at the end, Job lived 140 years, seeing his family into the 4th generation. And so Job died an old man and full of years. Job 42, verse 17. With Jeff Walling here, can I get an aww? Thank you. Jeff appreciates the response. So, a very happy ending for Job, a man of faith who spoke the truth about God and who was God's servant. And he was richly rewarded in the end. But, as they say on late night television, wait, there's more. Job is mentioned once in the New Testament. James chapter 5 and verse 11 says, you have heard of the steadfastness of Job. So, if you want to remember what the book is about, it's not really about suffering, which I think if you were to ask people, what's Job about? Well, it's about suffering. Well, the context is suffering, but that's not really what the book is about. The book is about faithfulness and steadfastness. The book is not really even about patience. You hear the phrase, the patience of Job. Well, of course he had to be patient, but that was not the core story. You have heard, James writes, about the steadfastness of Job, about how he was faithful to God under even the most difficult of circumstances. So, wherever we are in life, we should join with Job, who said in chapter 19, I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand on the earth. And after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. I myself will see him with my own eyes, I and not another, how my heart yearns within me. Again, a great testimonial. I know that my Redeemer lives, and I'm going to see him, and how my heart yearns for that moment. So that's Job, not fully reinvented, but greatly strengthened, and with much deeper insight and faith in God. And these are the lessons that we want to learn. I thought maybe we would be brave enough to sing a chorus with Job of this great verse that we close with. I know that my Redeemer lives. And I didn't ask one. This is a little old school, maybe for one by one, so I might have to leave this one myself. And we'll just sing the chorus. And just remember, this is part of the happy ending, so we can sing with joy and enthusiasm. Imagine Job sitting over here with his 10,000 sheep and goats and children and everybody with the happy ending. Let's sing just the chorus. I know that my Redeemer lives. I know eternal life he gives. I know that my Redeemer lives. I know that my Redeemer lives. I know eternal life he gives. I know that my Redeemer lives. Now we'll turn it over to the professional song, our closing song. Let's stand.